Hello, friends. I hope you're all doing well. I'm going to be talking about new historicism and cultural materialism today. So it's kind of related to Marxism, but not that much, actually. Uh, well, in fact, new historicism and cultural materialism are almost the same thing. And it's a little bit complicated. So please listen very carefully. I'm also going to give you a link to a YouTube video from a professor from Yale University, and he talks in detail about the text. About new historicism and not cultural materialism. He only talks about new historicism. So if you are really interested, you can also watch this video as well. But his video is actually more complicated. So let's start. As usual, we have a quotation from Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's an American writer, as you know. There is no history, only biography. All right. So Ralph Waldo Emerson actually means, he actually tries to say here that all history, all narratives of history are actually one-sided. Okay, so he actually tries to say that there are multiple histories, and the prevalent, the dominant history that people read, that people study, that people are aware of, are actually written by the victors. Okay, you probably heard this saying: history is written by the victors. Okay, by those who are victorious. All right, so this quotation is similar to that, and this quotation is actually somehow relevant to new historicism and cultural materialism, because both of these schools, both of these literary criticisms, actually say that literature is like a work of literature is like a historical document, and also at the same time, history or a historical document is also similar to literature, and so therefore there is no history, only biography. But of course, I mean, Ralph Waldo Emerson was not a new historicist or a cultural materialist. Okay, you shouldn't think that. It's just that this quotation is only relevant to these literary criticisms. All right, as usual, I have prepared this presentation from multiple sources. And one of those sources is your course book by Peter Barry, Literary Criticism. But I have also mixed some paragraphs from other books as well. So let's start with definition of historicism, or we can maybe start from what old historicism is. Okay, so historicism is the study of history. That's very clear. Okay, that's something that you already know. So the study of history is called historicism. So when you make if you read a literary work, a literary text within the historical context, okay, for example, if you are reading a text by Shakespeare, a play by Shakespeare, or a sonnet from Shakespeare, and if you are making references from the historical period, then you are making a historicist reading. Okay, so this is called old historicism. In old historicism, is actually something that we have been doing quite extensively in all of our courses, and it's also a method that students are also used to from their high school years as well, because what we normally do is we learn about the historical period, and then we learn about the literary texts written during this historical period, and we try to create a context. So the context is the historical context, and but our main focus is usually in our literature classes. Our main focus is not on the historical texts, but on the literary texts, right? Think about your Introduction to Britain class. So in that class, what I normally do, as you know, is I talk about the history of the period, and then in following weeks, I give you some literary works from that period, and we try to contextualize those poems, those short stories. And so one of your questions, one of your midterm exam questions, midterm essay questions was actually, so you were supposed to write an essay, and the topic of the essay was that you should write an essay which tried to prove why a poem written during I'm sorry, I'm mixing the classes again. Sorry, you are fourth year students. So in third year and second year and first year students midterm exams, I gave them the same topic. So write why this poem belongs to Victorian period, for example. Okay, I mean, what makes this poem a Victorian, or what makes this poem a Renaissance poem? Okay, so what I actually wanted them to do is to make them make them a historicist reading, and this kind of reading is called old historicism. So let me try something else, right? Okay, I'm going to try something different. Okay, so I'm going to try to draw something. Okay. So this is our poem. Okay. So this is a text. Think of this rectangle as a paper, as a document, as a text, poem. So what we normally do, what we usually do is, so this is the, okay. So we do, so this is the literary text and it's on the front, okay? All right, so there is a second document here behind the poem, behind the literary text. And we are going to call this the historical document, okay? And when we, again, if you think about your Introduction to Britain class, in the first week, for example, I talk about the Renaissance period. And how do we learn about the Renaissance period actually? From historical documents, right? So the historical documents are behind the poem in our classes, okay? But for example, a historian is only interested in the historical document. But a scholar of literature is interested in the literary text, okay? But so this literary document is behind the literary text, literary document. Let's call this one. Oops. Literary document, okay? And this method is called alt historicism or historicism. All right. So let's keep this here. So we can say that the founder, the person who started new historicism, is American critic Stephen Greenblatt. Okay, so so he published a book. It's a very famous book, Renaissance Self-Fashioning. So with this book, he started a new type of literary criticism, and that's new historicism. Okay, so what he did was, I mean, he introduced a new approach to the relationship between literary texts and their historical contexts. So, but what he did differently was that rather than seeing history as the background for study of literature, Greenblatt reads both literary and nonfiction texts. By nonfiction, we mean historical texts, okay? Nonfiction texts alongside each other. So Greenblatt not only uses non-fictional sources to explain the fictional, but he also uses the fictional texts to question some of the arguments made in the historical texts. So what does that mean? So by putting these two texts next to each other, so in our drawing a few minutes ago, we placed the historical text behind the literary text, right? But Greenblatt does something different. He puts them next to each other, side by side. So, and he treats the literary text as a historical document. How? For example, you read a play by Shakespeare, and by reading this play, you can actually learn some things about the Renaissance period, right? And so, for example, if there is something in a historical text from the Renaissance period, but if there is something else about the same topic, a different information about the same topic from in the literary text, then you can also question the validity of the historical text as well. So which one are you going to believe in? So which one is the true, which one is authentic, which one is correct, which one is more helpful to us in when we are trying to understand history, for example, Renaissance history. So can we treat the literary text as a historical document? That's what Greenblatt asks. And he says, yes, we should treat literary texts as historical texts because historical texts are not neutral. Okay, so historical texts are always written by people, and people are not neutral. That's what he says. So this new approach is what we call new historicism. In new historicism, there is no context, no background and foreground. Rather, the fiction and non-fiction are both interrogated alongside each other as co-texts. So here in the first part, in old historicism, there is context. There is historical context, historical background. But in new historicism, there is no context. There are only co-texts. So I hope you know what co means. I mean, for example, co-pilot in a if you're a rally driver, for example, you have a co-pilot, a pilot, a driver sitting, another pilot sitting next to you. Okay, so he is your helper. He is helping you. So co-texts. Co-texts means two separate texts which are side by side, which are next to each other, and which are actually helping you together with the same amount of helpfulness. Okay, so quite often this means beginning a piece of literary criticism not with the literary text, but with the reading of a non-fiction source, but analyzing it in the same way as fiction. The historical text that is read as fiction supplants the usual contexts that are often given as introductory scene settings in works of literary criticism. So let's make a new drawing now. So we have here our old historicism, where the historical document, historical text is behind the literary document. But now we are going to create a drawing for new historicism. So we have here we have our literary document here, and then we have our historical document here. So that is called, this method is called new historicism. Okay, so we have two, oops, sorry. We have two kinds of methods here where there's old historicism and new historicism. So in old historicism, historical document only feeds the literary document and it's in the background. But in new historicism, these texts have equal value, okay? And each are, so literary document can be considered as a historical document as well, because we can learn about the history of Renaissance by reading Shakespeare, for example. And at the same time, the historical document can also be read as a work of fiction, because history means story, okay? History means story. History means fiction, according to new historicists. All right. So there's no context, they are co-texts. So, because, I mean, for much of the 20th century, the influence of formalism meant that the historical context of a work of literature seemed of little importance. With the introduction of reader response theory, historical context once again became important. So we learned about reader response theory in our earlier classes. This was only increased when critical approaches such as Marxism, feminism, post-colonial theory focused on the relationship between the text, he means the literary text, between the text and specific social and political contexts. So we are still in the old historicism part. As these contexts are impossible to understand without also understanding the specific histories in which they function, more political readings have also produced much more historical readings. So new historicists came out of a post-structuralist influenced American school of criticism. At the same time, British critics were also reappraising the role of history in the study of literature. So we're going to be learning about cultural materialism next. I mean, so new historicism is the American version, but cultural materialism is the British version. Okay. So new historicism then is not really about historical context. Instead, it's about history as a kind of text that is in its own way as imaginative as a fictional text. So history is fictional, according to new historicists. So this slide is actually telling you what I just told you in my in the drawing. Okay, so I'm going to skip that one. But there is an interesting quotation here, actually, by Louis Montreux, and he says there was an interest in the textuality of history and historicity of texts. Okay, so this is quite similar to what Ralph Waldo Emerson tells us in the quotation at the beginning of this presentation, the textuality of history and historicity of texts. All right. So what do new historicist critics do? What do? So they juxtapose literary and non-literary texts, reading the former in the light of the latter. They try thereby to defamiliarize the literary text, detaching it from the accumulated weight of previous literary scholarship and seeing it as if new. So they just forget what they have learned so far about the text. They just start the text, start reading, they just start approaching the literary texts from a new perspective. They focus their attention within both text and co-text. So the text is literary text and co-text is the historical texts, on issues of state power and how it is maintained, on patriarchal structures and their perpetuation, and on the process of colonization with its accompanying mindset. So both new historicism and cultural materialism are quite political methods, okay, just like Marxism. That's why at the beginning of the presentation I said that they are similar to Marxism. What I meant was that both these two, I mean, new historicism and cultural materialism, were both very much political methods of literary criticism. So they look at the literary texts and try to see the traces of patriarchy or classicism, things like that, in the texts. All right. Fourthly, they make use of the notion that every facet of reality is textualized. So again, this method is about history, okay? So history is actually textualized. How do we learn about our history? From texts, from documents, right? From historical documents. When I say historical document, I don't mean your high school history books. Okay, these are not primary sources. What new historicists do is they don't look at the history books. They look at the original documents, historical documents that you find in archives. Okay, in state archives, for example. A correspondence, a letter. I mean, between an Ottoman Sultan and Queen of England, for example. Okay, they look at a letter, or they look at a law, which made during the Victorian period, and they put these historical documents next to a poem written at the same time, around the same time as this law text. Okay, let's talk about cultural materialism. So the cultural materialism was created by the British critics. Okay, they are like new historicists. they also stress the status of the literary text as a historical document. So in this respect, they are the same. They consider literary text as a historical document and the need to read both types of texts equally alongside each other. All right. So the British critic Graham Holderness describes cultural materialism as a politicized form of historiography. So cultural materialism, the British version, is actually more politicized than new historicism. All right. We can explain this as meaning the study of historical material, which includes literary texts within a politicized framework. This framework including the present, which those literary texts have in some way helped to shape. All right. So when we were talking about neo criticism, we always talked about we put the literary works in their historical times, but what cultural materialism does differently is they try to understand how works of literature have been used after they were written, how they were used by different generations of politicians, for example, or different societies. For example, I'm going to give very interesting examples later. So cultural, again, I'm repeating what I just said. Cultural materialism looks at how literary texts have been used by people who have the power, who have political power. Okay? The two words in the term cultural materialism are further defined. Culture will include all forms of culture, forms like television and popular music and fiction. So cultural materialism is not only about literature. Okay, so you can make a criticism, a literary criticism of works of other types of works of art as well, like television and popular music, fiction. Okay. That is, this approach does not limit itself to high cultural forms like Shakespeare play. Cultural materialism particularly involves using the past to read the present, revealing the politics of our own society by what we choose to emphasize or suppress of the past. So cultural materialists actually quite more commonly, they look at our present day. Okay, for example, how do British people view Shakespeare today? Or how do Turkish people or Turkish politicians view Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, for example? So, or Nazım Hikmet. I'm deliberately choosing controversial poets right now, okay? In these examples, I'm deliberately choosing controversial poets. So how have the politicians used the poems of these two poems, of these two poets today, and for what? Okay. What do cultural materialist critics do? They read the literary text in such a way as to enable us to recover its histories, that is, the context of exploitation from which it emerged. So that's the beginning. At the same time, they foreground those elements in the work's present transmission and contextualizing which caused those histories to be lost in the first place. They use a combination of Marxist and feminist approaches to the text, especially in order to do the first of these above, and in order to fracture the previous dominance of conservative social, political, and religious assumptions in Shakespeare criticism in particular. At the same time, they work mainly within traditional notions of the canon, on the grounds that writing about more obscure texts hardly ever constitutes an effective political intervention. So, the differences between the two. Cultural materialism is often linked in discussions with new historicism. its American counterpart. Though the two movements belong to the same family, there is an ongoing family quarrel between them. The most important difference between New Historicism and cultural materialism is that New Historicism's documents are contemporary with Shakespeare. Again, this is an example. It doesn't have to be Shakespeare, but what usually historically, new historicists and cultural materialists were Shakespeare scholars. Okay, that's why most of their works have been about Shakespeare. But there are other present day literary critics who believe in who support, who use, let's say, not believe or support, but who use new historicism and cultural materialism, who focus on different authors as well. So don't be misled by Shakespeare, by the name Shakespeare here. Okay, so they don't have to be about Shakespeare. Sorry, I lost where I was. The most important difference between New Historicism and cultural materialism is that where New Historicism's core-texts are documents contemporary with Shakespeare, the texts of cultural materialism may be the program notes for a current means modern, present day, Royal Shakespeare Company production, quotations of Shakespeare by a pilot in the Gulf War, or pronouncements on education by a government minister. To put this another way, the new historicist situates the literary text in the political situation of its own day, while the cultural materialist situates it within that of ours. For example, let me give you another example. I hope you have understood new historicism. Let me give you an example about cultural materialism. So, if we think about, cultural materialists, as we learned, they don't only look at literature, they also look at works of popular culture as well, like movies, TV programs as well. So in Turkish televisions, there are so many TV serials, TV shows about Ottoman history. Like, I don't know, Payitaht Abdülhamit, or Diriliş Ertuğrul, things like that. So many TV shows about Ottoman history. And these are works of art, okay? According to cultural materialists, these are works of art. So, 200 years later, a cultural, not 200 years later, so a cultural materialist asks this question: why are there so many TV shows about the Ottoman history in 2020? They try to give an answer. They would say that because the current government is a conservative government, because the current government wants people to look back at their history, and the current government wants the citizens to like Ottoman history. That's why there are so many TV shows about Ottoman history. Okay, so where do the directors or the screenwriters of these TV shows learn about the Ottoman history? They look at the historical texts. Okay, so therefore these TV shows are like historical documents, just as well as they are examples for literary documents. Okay, so the reason, the idea that the cultural materialist critic would come to as a conclusion would be that the reason that there are so many TV shows about Ottoman history on Turkish televisions is related to the current government's policy. All right. That's how you can differentiate cultural materialism from new historicism. So as our book says, the new historicist situates the literary text in the political situation of its own day, while the cultural materialist situates it within that of ours.